In case you forgot, there was once a time when a vast majority of the American landscape wasn't covered in massive housing developments, sprawling metropolitan areas, huge shopping centers, and way too many parking lots. Thankfully, some of the old beauty still remains today, and in places like the Great Smoky Mountains, the splendor of nature has been drawing in all sorts of people for centuries, each with their own experiences and stories to tell. And since I'm here in the Smoky Mountains myself, I wanted to take the opportunity to explore some of those tales, namely the ones that have stood the test of time as myths, fables, superstitions, or just an interesting part of the area's past. People have been making history and telling stories in these mountains for centuries, and sometimes the stuff they come up with can be pretty intriguing, entertaining, and at times, even a little frightening. So with that said, come with me on a little trip to explore some of the mysteries, legends, and folklore of the Smoky Mountains. The land in and around the Smoky Mountains is rich with resources that people have been making use of for centuries. And as the US grew during the 1800s, a lot of people explored the Smoky Mountains in hopes that they would make it big. One such man was a blacksmith named Perry Schultz, who in 1867 claimed to have discovered a rich vein of gold just beneath the ground somewhere in the Greenbrier Cove area. Schultz quickly got a charter from the Tennessee government to mine there, but for whatever reason, the charter only allowed him to mine for silver, lead, copper, and zinc. No one seems to know for sure why this was, but I believe it could have been one of Schultz's many efforts to keep people from discovering his fortune. Because if people knew someone was mining gold in a specific area, then there was a big chance that Schultz would face some competition. In the years that followed, Schultz's mining efforts seemed to be successful, as the wealth he accrued was much more than most people in the area had, causing many of the locals to believe that Schultz may have actually indeed struck gold. And as the speculation grew, Schultz became more and more secretive. He began taking different trails to and from wherever his mine was, so that no one could follow him and create a reliable route of where the gold might be. He even withheld the mine's location from his wife, and unfortunately, this secret would ultimately be his undoing. As he grew older, Schultz would eventually suffer a stroke that limited his ability to communicate, meaning that he was unable to effectively tell his wife where in the Smoky Mountains the secret mine could be found. And after his death, tales of Schultz's hidden mine became legend, and for years, most people gave up trying to figure out where he had actually hid his fortune. But in 1967, a man named Walt Rice purchased the property that had once belonged to Schultz, and while doing some landscaping in the old garden, he discovered an old clay pot buried in the ground, and inside it was over $37,000 worth of gold and silver, which in today's money is around $300K. Now, this discovery rekindled talk of Schultz's lost mine, and treasure hunters from all over began combing the area once again, hoping to find it. Some of the locals also tried to capitalize on the craze and began offering rumors or pieces of Schultz's old maps that indicated the mine's location. And obviously, these people had no clue where the mine was or if it even existed, and they were just trying to make a quick buck off of eager treasure hunters. But all the same, rumors arose that the mine was somewhere around Webb Creek, and others claimed to have discovered evidence that Schultz had created a tunnel in Porter's Flat that reached all the way to North Carolina. But as more and more people searched for Schultz's lost mine, it seemed to become less and less likely that it would ever be found. In fact, if you come to Porter's Flat, which is the alleged location of the hidden mine, all you'll see here are trees, rocks, and dirt, and not really much else. To this day, no one has been able to discover any indication of where the mine might have actually been, leading most to believe that it never existed at all. Now, there's obviously been some doubt about Schultz's claims of finding gold in them there hills, and a big reason for this, besides the incredible lack of evidence that a mine ever existed, is because Schultz had a reputation for being a swindler and con man, and it was actually because one of his schemes that Schultz even ended up in the Smoky Mountains to begin with. Being a blacksmith, Schultz had access to a forge that could melt precious metals like gold and silver, and he was also good friends with a man who worked for the US Mint. Now, this friend was able to steal some mold plates used to make coins, and the two then went into hiding in the Smokies, where they began making counterfeit coins that were so convincing that no one caught on until the US Treasury itself got some of the coins in their possession and then began tracking down the counterfeiters. When the Secret Service eventually came looking for Schultz, he threw the mold pieces into the Pigeon River before leaving town and heading west, where he kept a low profile for the rest of his life, leaving people to wonder what he was really up to. Now, given all that information, here is my hypothesis about what really happened with Perry Schultz and his lost mine in Greenbrier Cove. There is no mine, there never was a mine, and Perry in fact never found any gold at all. See, I think what may have happened is that Schultz made up the whole story about the gold mine to explain how he was actually acquiring so much gold, when in reality, the coin counterfeiting project was the real moneymaker. Eh? See, if you remember, Schultz had a permit to mine for copper, lead, zinc, and silver, and while all those metals are valuable, they aren't nearly as valuable as gold. So what I think could have happened is that Schultz would take the real coins made of gold or silver, melt them down, and then take some of the lesser valuable metals like lead or zinc, and then use them to reform the coins using the stolen molds. He would then plate the fake coins with a thin layer of silver or gold and keep the rest to remake actual coins, which he hid away in the clay pot. He came up with the story about the mine so that when he started gaining all this wealth, people would assume that it was because he was actually finding gold and not because he was making counterfeit coins. And the reason he was so secretive about where his mine was located was not because he didn't want anybody to find it, but because he didn't want to be found out. If people followed him to where he was mining and realized that there was never any gold, then they would probably become very suspicious about where he was getting all the gold from, and then he would be in trouble. Now, the legend of the lost gold mine hidden somewhere in the woods is a super fun concept, and perhaps that's why, despite overwhelming lack of evidence, the story of Perry Schultz's mine has stuck around. There's a lot of mystery and intrigue about places like the Smoky Mountains, and amongst all the fantastical tales of spirits and monsters that we're about to talk about, a story about a con man doing what con men do has been able to stand right up there with them, and honestly, that's pretty impressive. But if you're hoping that Schultz's lost mine was not the only mystery location hidden in the Smoky Mountains, then you're in luck, because long before Perry Schultz came to the Smoky Mountains to make his mark, the Cherokee had their own superstitions and tales about the area. According to native tradition, somewhere in the mountains west of the Onakalufti River lies the enchanted lake known as Atagahi. The lake is not one that can be found on a map or happened across while hiking through the backcountry. See, the Cherokee believed that Atagahi was a mystical oasis in the forest that provided a safe haven for all sorts of animals to enjoy its enchanted waters and find sanctuary from humans. And of the many people who claim to have sought Atagahi, only a few ever actually found it. Many Cherokee over the years said that they had discovered the location of the lake, but upon returning to show others where it was, they saw only a dry, flat area with no water or animal life to be found. And it was because of this that many people believed that you couldn't actually find Atagahi, but that it would find you. One Cherokee tale recounts of how this very thing happened to a brother and sister named Utani and Nitani. Utani had been given a new knife as a gift, and one day he was admiring its shine in the sunlight, and his sister Nitani kept asking what he was doing and wanting to see, blocking the sunlight with her shadow. Annoyed and wanting to get rid of his sister, he told her that the glare from the sun on his blade was pointing the way to Atagahi, to which Nitani excitedly took off into the woods to look for the enchanted lake. Utani went after her to help her look, not wanting to spoil his sister's fun, and they searched the woods for hours, but as evening came, the two were tired and hungry and agreed to just go home and continue searching for Atagahi in the morning. As they turned around on the trail, Utani's foot slipped and kicked some rocks down an embankment. And to their surprise, the children heard a loud splash as the rocks reached the bottom where there wasn't supposed to be any body of water. Curious, Utani and Nitani ventured off the trail and pushed through the thicket after the rocks. And upon pushing aside some bushes, Utani and Nitani found themselves on the shores of the violet waters of Atagahi. And since it was late, the children decided to return the next day and explore the lake further. So they returned home and told their parents how Utani's knife had led them to find the enchanted lake, but they were laughed off as just telling childish tales. But this didn't discourage the children, and they would continue to visit Atagahi for years to come, always kicking rocks off the trail and waiting for the sound of splashing water to find the enchanted lake. It's said that if you find yourself alone on a backcountry trail in the Smoky Mountains, there's a chance you might encounter the spirits of Utani and Nitani still kicking around rocks to find the entrance to Atagahi. Now, some Cherokee did believe that it was actually possible to intentionally gain entry into Atagahi, but only with pure intentions and after a time of fasting and meditation. You would first need to venture into the woods and follow the sounds of birds and other animals until you heard the sound of thousands of geese and ducks circling overhead. The lake would not appear to you just yet, though, as you then needed to spend the night fasting and meditating, which allowed the creatures of the forest to decide if you were worthy to enter Atagahi. If you found favor with them, you would then be able to see the enchanted lake and talk with the animals there. There's another story that tells of a young Cherokee brave who did just that, but sadly, it doesn't have as happy an ending. Now, this young man had grown up hearing tales of Atagahi and wanted to see it for himself. He had no nefarious motives like hunting the animals there or stealing some of the mystical waters. He simply wanted to find the enchanted lake, to look upon its beauty, and finally see the magical oasis he had heard about all his life. So he ventured into the woods, followed the sounds of the animals, and spent days fasting and meditating in the wilderness until one day he found it. Because of his pure intentions, the animals in Atagahi saw him as a friend and allowed him to visit Atagahi whenever he wanted, so long as his heart remained pure. He would visit many times after that, marking the entrance to Atagahi with a small rock cairn to remember where it was. But soon after, a horrible winter struck the area, and many Cherokee faced harsh weather and found themselves on the brink of starvation. Fearing that his family would die if he could not provide any food, the man decided that his only option was to break his oath with the animals of Atagahi and hunt at the sacred lake. When he returned to Atagahi, the man saw a bear on the shore of the water and shot it with his bow. The arrow struck true, and the wounded bear fell into the water, but as the man went to retrieve his kill, the bear stood up, resurrected from its wounds, and healed by the mystical powers of the water. The bear then spoke to the hunter, angry that he had betrayed the trust of Atagahi and telling him that he was no longer a friend to the creatures of the forest, after which the animals descended on the man in a horde of teeth and claws. A few days later, some of the other hunters from the man's village began searching the forest for him, and they eventually found his mangled body in the snow, but there were no bear tracks and no indication of how he had gotten there. And since then, it's believed that the creatures of the forest will never again allow humans to enter into the enchanted lake of Atagahi. That is, of course, if you believe these old tales, because despite the legends, Lake Atagahi is actually a real location that can be found just near the Carolina borders. Now, this Lake Atagahi is in a private park for residents of the Contesty Falls community in Transylvania County, so it's safe to say that it's probably not the actual Atagahi from Cherokee legend. Unless, of course, the people of Contesty Falls are really the forest creatures in disguise that have changed their ways to adapt with the times and keep up with human expansion, and instead of fasting and meditation to get in, you have to buy one of their multi-million-dollar homes and join their POA. At any rate, tales of a mystical lake with life-giving properties that provides a respite for all kinds of woodland creatures that can only be found by those pure of heart is kind of a nice story, and it's a good reminder that as much as people want to explore or, unfortunately, exploit nature, it's still something that is worthy of our respect. Now, I'm sure you're all hoping there are more stories and legends from the Smoky Mountains that aren't just about con men, magic purple water, or talking bears. Some of the best folk tales are about spooky stuff, and don't worry, I've got some of that for you too. See, the Cherokee didn't just have a reverence for nature because of its beauty and wonder, but they also had a fear of it because the vast wilderness was home to all sorts of creatures, some of which were anything but natural. I'm sure we've all heard that it's usually not a good idea to go off into the woods alone, and to the Cherokee, this wasn't just because of predators or the chance to get lost or hurt with no way of finding help. One of their biggest fears was that you would fall victim to the creature known as Spearfinger. Known to the Cherokee as Utlunta, Spearfinger was a malevolent creature that preyed on anyone who was unfortunate enough to find themselves alone in the woods. The name Utlunta roughly translates to the one with the spear, and as the creature's name would suggest, her most defining feature was her right hand stuck in a gnarled fist with a long, sharp obsidian talon sticking out of her index finger. You could often tell if she was on the hunt nearby, as sounds of her moving through the woods sounded like the crashing of rocks or rumbling thunder. According to Cherokee legend, Spearfinger would prowl the southeastern area of the Smoky Mountains in search of children or lone travelers who she would lure into the woods by taking the form of an elderly woman and singing a haunting song that drew in her prey. She would then use her finger to slice open her victims and eat their livers before taking their form and returning home, masquerading as that person while embedding herself into the community and picking her next kill. If for some reason her deception was discovered, there was not really anything anyone could do to stop her, as Spearfinger's skin was rock hard and impenetrable. Now, Spearfinger also had a rival named Stoneman, or Nunyanui, who ate livers and had impenetrable skin just like she did, and they would often cross paths in the forest, but they saw each other more as enemies and not allies. Rather than a razor-sharp claw, Stoneman had a magical staff that allowed him to move large rocks or other heavy objects, as well as control people's minds and summon spirits. Stoneman could also use the staff to guide him towards a village to find his victims, pointing it in a certain direction and then sniffing the end of it, following the scent as it got stronger the closer he got to his prey. Now, for whatever reason, the Cherokee seemed to have more of a fearful reverence for Stoneman, whereas they really only held hatred for Spearfinger, and it was this hatred for her that would be her undoing. As Spearfinger continued to claim victims, the Cherokee began to notice a pattern in her attacks. See, it seemed that whenever they would go into the woods to harvest chestnuts, there was a very good chance that Spearfinger would come to take another victim. In order to harvest chestnuts, the Cherokee would start fires underneath the trees, which would cause the nuts to fall to the ground and then be collected. Now, the Cherokee realized that the large amount of smoke produced by the process was basically a beacon to Spearfinger, but they came up with a plan to use this to their advantage. A council was made up of men from several different villages, and they assembled to make a plan to end Spearfinger's reign of terror for good. They figured that she must have had some sort of weakness, but they needed a chance to figure out what it was. Obviously, a murderous shapeshifter with a razor-sharp claw and impenetrable skin is a little hard to examine, so the council came up with the plan to trap Spearfinger and attack her in all sorts of ways until something worked. So they dug a deep pit and filled it with sharp spikes, and then started a large fire to draw her out, and sure enough, Spearfinger came out from the woods and approached the fire. Some of the men were hesitant to attack her because of her old lady disguise, but as she drew nearer, she fell into the pit, crashing against the spikes on her way down, but remaining unharmed. With her disguise ruined, the Cherokee began attacking her with arrows and spears, but to no avail. A titmouse then flew by and landed on Spearfinger, chirping a song that seemed to be telling the men to shoot her in the heart. Spearfinger was suddenly filled with fear, and the warriors thought that they had finally found her weakness, but as they continued to fire arrow after arrow, nothing happened. Enraged and angry that the bird had lied to them, the men then caught the titmouse and cut off its tongue. As the bird flew away, Spearfinger began to laugh and revel in knowing that her secret was still safe, singing her haunting song in mockery of the men. But a short time later, a chickadee came and landed on Spearfinger, this time perching on her clawed right hand. Spearfinger suddenly became enraged and full of fear, and then the men realized that they finally knew Spearfinger's weakness. The reason that her right hand was always clutched in a fist was because that was where her heart was. The hunters quickly began firing arrows at Spearfinger's right arm, and one of the arrows found its mark, striking Spearfinger's wrist in just the right place, and with a cry of pain and anger, Spearfinger crumbled into a pile of rocks. Her reign of terror was finally over. As the men cheered and celebrated their victory, the noise drew the attention of Stoneman, who came across the mountains to see what was going on. And when he saw Spearfinger's obsidian claw mounted on a post next to the entrance of the village, he saw it as a warning from the Cherokee. But when he remembered that the Cherokee didn't know his weakness, he laughed to himself and went off into the woods, singing a song about eating livers and knowing that his hunting grounds had just gotten a little bit bigger. Sometime later, a hunter was in the woods when he spied Stoneman using his magic staff to guide him towards a nearby village to find himself a liver to eat. The hunter then took off towards the village to warn them before Stoneman got there, and fortunately for the villagers, and unfortunately for Stoneman, the medicine man of the village had a hunch on what his weakness was. Period blood. Remember, Stoneman found his victims by following the scent on the end of his staff, implying that he had a rather strong sense of smell. The medicine man speculated that if he could gather enough women who were in that time of the month, then their scent would be so off-putting to Stoneman that it might actually kill him. So with Stoneman drawing close, the medicine man went through the village and found 7 women and had them line up outside the entrance to the village. When Stoneman finally came down the path and passed the first woman, he was instantly filled with disgust and reprimanded her. But when he moved on past the second girl, he was so put off that he actually started convulsing and vomiting blood. Stoneman continued to stumble towards the village, with his condition becoming worse and worse with every girl he passed until he reached the 7th and final girl. He was so disgusted by her state that he collapsed on the path in a pool of blood. Seeing that Stoneman was finally vulnerable, the medicine man of the village drove 7 wooden stakes through his body, pinning him to the ground. Then the people of the village piled a whole bunch of logs on top of him and prepared to light a fire. Finally, fearing for his life for the first time in a long time, or possibly ever, Stoneman began to spout out all sorts of divine wisdoms to the people, such as cures for various sicknesses and secrets of nature. But this didn't stop the villagers, who lit the fire and watched it burn late into the night. As he was consumed by the flames, Stoneman began crying out in song, calling to the beasts of the forest to come help him, but as the flames continued to consume him, his voice grew weak and his body began to burn up. By morning, there was nothing left but a pile of white ash. The medicine man scraped away the ash to see if there was anything left of Stoneman, but all he found was a magical rock called an ulunsunti and a red substance called wadi that the medicine man used to make a special body paint. He called the people of the village to him and began to paint on their faces and chests, telling them that any prayers they made while wearing the paint would be answered. While the stories of Spearfinger and Stoneman aren't quite as interesting and memorable as other folklore creatures like Wendigo or Bigfoot, they're still a special part of Cherokee tradition, and it's partially because these stories are a bit lesser known that they caught my attention in the first place, and why I felt they were worth sharing. But tales and legends from decades and centuries past aren't the only stories to tell about the Smoky Mountains. As times have changed, superstitions about creepy monsters in the woods have been replaced by the fear of something that is debatably far scarier: government conspiracy. As I talked about before, the land of the Smoky Mountains was very enticing to pioneers and entrepreneurs because of its landscape and natural resources, but that didn't last forever. Now, there's a theory that some would classify in the conspiracy variety that after the area was no longer marketable for things like logging or mining or other types of industry, the US government decided to capitalize on the land by having it repurposed into a national park. Now, this on its own doesn't sound too far outside the realm of possibility, and to some degree that pretty much is exactly what happened, but when you dive a bit deeper into how the government actually did this, that's when you're getting into tinfoil hat territory. Some of the main reasons people visit the Smoky Mountains is for the impressive views and the incredible wildlife, but according to this conspiracy theory, it's all a big fabrication. You see, the rolling fog and low-hanging clouds that give the Smoky Mountains their name are not actually caused by something natural like weather, or the abundant vegetation emitting vapors and compounds into the air, because that would just be too easy and make a little too much sense, now wouldn't it? What if I told you that hidden throughout the deep woods of the Smokies are dozens of massive fog machines operated by the National Park Service? These fog machines pump artificial fog into the air to create the hazy look that the Smokies are known for. And this is the National Park Service's way to control the picturesque look of the landscape, and the prettier you make it look, the more people want to visit over and over again. And obviously it works because the Great Smoky Mountain National Park is the most visited national park in the country, beating out even Yosemite and Yellowstone with over 10 million visitors per year. And taking into account that most of those people pay for a parking pass or a camping permit, the scheme certainly pays off. But the unique and beautiful landscape isn't the only thing that's being fabricated by the government. As I said before, the area is well known for the diverse wildlife that makes the area their home, but no animal is more symbolic and representative of the Smokies than the black bear. The Smoky Mountains are home to over 1,500 black bears, giving the area the highest population of the big critters east of the Mississippi River. That's about 2 bears per square mile, and with the millions of people coming to the park each year, sightings and encounters are incredibly common, but despite that, attacks are rather rare, with only a handful of incidents being recorded since the park opened in 1934. And this is because bear activity is not only closely monitored by park management, but it's actually entirely controlled and orchestrated by them. The reason that bears are typically so docile and frequently seen is because they are domesticated by the Park Service and then relocated to different parts of the park throughout the year, based on which areas are most popular during the different seasons. These bears are either bred or captured and then kept by the Park Service to be conditioned into being comfortable around humans. They are then relocated into the Smoky Mountain National Park and released in areas with a large concentration of tourists to increase chances of sightings. There are so few incidents with bears because they are domesticated and therefore used to being around people, making them less scared to go near areas with large concentrations of people. Now, when you lay it all out like that, it actually makes some pretty darn good sense if you ask me. Besides, if the government can replace all of the pigeons in metropolitan areas with drone lookalikes to spy on everyone, or use space lasers to incinerate anything that isn't painted blue, then using the National Park Service to fabricate a tourism destination is a walk in the park for them. A walk in the national park, that is. But the federal government aren't the only people that have tried to capitalize on the beauty of the Smoky Mountains for personal monetary gain. Plenty of people and companies over the years have tried to cash in on the potential of the area, and unfortunately for some, it didn't always work out. Success doesn't always find everyone, and while the tourism juggernauts of Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg will probably be around for years to come, the same can't be said for the ghost town of Elkmont. The town that would eventually become Elkmont got its start as a small mountain community of pioneers in the 1840s known as Little River, getting its name from the little river that it was built on. The first settlers there lived as subsistence farmers, growing things like corn, apples, and beehives, and in 1880 a logging entrepreneur named John English came to the area with plans to use Jake's Creek to transport lumber to the nearby town of Knoxville. But a destructive flood in 1899 dealt him a massive blow, and he would give up the logging endeavor a year later. In 1908, Colonel Wilson Townsend picked up where English left off, establishing the Little River Logging Company and constructing a much more robust infrastructure for moving lumber. Whereas English used the river itself to transport logs, Townsend constructed a rail system between Maryville and Knoxville using flat cars to move lumber through the backcountry. As the work moved further and further into the mountains, the need for a transfer station arose to move the lumber from higher elevations, so Townsend established a logging camp to serve that purpose, and it was called Elkmont. While it started out as little more than a shanty town made up of portable buildings in and around the village of Little River, Elkmont would go on to establish more permanent structures over time, and eventually it became the primary base of operations for the Little River Logging Company. As the area became more and more stripped of lumber, Townsend realized that the now permanent nature of Elkmont had potential for more than just the logging industry, and as early as 1909 he began to present the town as a gateway into the Appalachian Mountains for hunters and tourists. Townsend began using the Little River Railroad as a way to shuttle visitors from Knoxville into Elkmont, and this proved to be successful for a number of years. A group of outdoor enthusiasts called the Appalachia Club even built their own lodge in Elkmont, and in 1912, Townsend partnered with a man named Charlie Carter to build the Wonderland Hotel as an alternate for folks who weren't part of the Appalachia Club. Lodges and cabins were later built, and by 1925, Elkmont was a pretty successful resort town. But there was trouble in paradise for Colonel Townsend, who came to realize that while tourism was doing well for Elkmont, the logging industry was starting to go downhill for the simple reason that there simply weren't enough trees left in the area for it to be profitable. So the Little River Company began making plans to move its focus to Walker Valley, which was about 9 miles west. This meant that the railway between Elkmont and Knoxville was no longer practical for moving lumber, and so rather than build a new one, Townsend decided that the best course of action was to dismantle it and move it to the new area. Knowing that the people of Elkmont would be enraged that the town would essentially be cut off, Townsend hid the project from them and had the tracks moved in secret. But as you can imagine, a railroad suddenly disappearing is kind of hard to miss, and so the people of Elkmont were rightfully and understandably outraged. However, thanks to Tennessee Governor Austin Peay, who owned a vacation lodge in Elkmont, the remnants of the deconstructed railway were used to build a road into the town. But unfortunately, the damage had already been done, and Elkmont put its best days behind it. Thankfully, though, some of the people of Elkmont and Knoxville had already been working to give the area life even after the logging industry and vacation resort were gone. Willis and Ann Davis were a couple who owned a cottage in Elkmont, and after visiting Yellowstone National Park, they came up with the idea to establish something like it in the area. They teamed up with fellow Elkmont property owner David Chapman and began a campaign to repurpose the area that quickly gained a lot of favor with the people of both Elkmont and Knoxville. Eventually, Colonel Townsend gave in to the pressure and sold over 75,000 acres of land to the Tennessee and North Carolina state governments, setting the stage for what would eventually become the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. The rest of the corporate goons at the Little River Logging Company did not give up easily, however, and they pushed hard to increase the real estate value of the area with things like better road infrastructure to prevent Elkmont from being overtaken by eminent domain. As an answer to this effort, the government agreed to let the residents and property owners of Elkmont sell their cottages at half price in exchange for lifetime leases on the land. These would eventually be converted to 20-year leases, with the final renewal being in 1972. As the years went on, the leaseholders would eventually all die off or move away until only one man was left, and incredibly, he was actually one of the first people to live in the area all the way back from when it was still the small mountain village of Little Creek. That man was Lem Ownby. Lem was the son of David Ownby, who was one of Little Creek's earliest residents when he brought his family to the area hoping to find gold. They lived in a cabin that David himself built near Jake's Creek, and Lem would live here until his death in 1984, spending his days selling honey to hikers and telling off any feds that came to visit. As the story goes, a lawyer from Knoxville named Foster Arnett was hosting 2 Supreme Court justices as they toured the area, and Arnett had the bold idea to introduce the 2 men to an authentic Tennessee mountain man. So Arnett took the... Whoa! Huge falcon just flew by. So Arnett took their honors to Elkmont to meet said mountain man, but when they got to his cabin and Arnett tried to introduce the men to Ownby, Ownby simply replied that he wasn't interested and that the two justices weren't allowed in his house. And while this was apparently incredibly embarrassing for Foster, the two justices thought that Ownby's bold refusal was hilarious for the simple fact that they were rarely, if ever, refused or told no. The men were apparently not offended in the slightest, and they would look fondly back on the failed encounter with Ownby for years afterwards. Today, what is left of Elkmont has been repurposed into a campground for national park visitors. Many of the original structures still stand, but most are in incredible states of disrepair. The National Park Service has made plans to restore and preserve several buildings, as the site is also recognized in the National Registry of Historic Places. Although the short and tumultuous history of Elkmont would eventually be undone by deception and corporate greed, it was that very undoing that paved the way for the birth of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and if there's any benefit to be found, that would certainly be it. I really enjoyed my time learning about the Smoky Mountains, and I've also enjoyed getting to share my experiences with you. This trip was an excellent opportunity to get out and enjoy the beauty of nature, and if you get the chance, I would totally recommend you come out here yourself, or tune in on my next trip, wherever that may be. Who knows, maybe this time next year I can write off another vacation as a business expense for my YouTube career. But that can't happen unless you remember to like this video, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and let me know what you think in the comments. Goodbye, everybody.